Greetings, I am Emmett, and if you notice that I sound a little froggier than normal, I am on the tail end of a chest cold of some sort. Don't worry, it's not the Rona. It's just one of those bugs that makes it feel all like... And today, I thought that I would talk a little Fallout. So, I enjoy a good game, but I don't really consider myself like an avid gamer. Mostly because any game that I do play is usually a few years old by the time I get to it. I started Fallout 4 a while back, but I just now got to downloading the Season Pass, which expands the map a bit and includes some new storylines, namely Far Harbor. As a random side note, there's a cat under here. I didn't know how much she would move. I thought maybe you wouldn't notice. So I feel like I've mostly heard people make fun of Fallout 4 online, which is another reason why I don't consider myself an avid gamer, because it seems like a lot of times I'm sort of out of touch. I guess I'm just not that picky. I don't really need a outstanding story or really groundbreaking graphics. I just want a fun game to play. I mean, I don't really remember Skyrim for all the great and memorable characters. It's mostly the overall atmosphere and world building that sucks you in. That being said, I do get into writing and film criticisms, and from that point of view, I do have some thoughts on Fallout Far Harbor. So even though this game, like I said, this game is several years old, I'm still gonna go over the basics of the story, just for context, because I'm going to do a fairly deep dive into some of the details. So spoiler warning, I'll try to avoid specific certain things, but I will be talking about the plot of the game, so there's going to be discussion of that topic. So, background information. The base storyline follows your character, the sole survivor, as they wake up from cryosleep to see their spouse murdered and their child taken. This is what spurs you to venture out into the wasteland in search of answers. Along your journey, you meet three main factions. Now, those factions, and basically just the world building as a whole, really hinges around the element of the synths. They call them robots, but they're really more like clones. The Institute, which is like the big bad guy of the game, basically, creates the synths that are copies of people, and then they implant them in their lives as sort of sleeper agents. They don't know that they're synths normally, but the Institute can sort of like activate them, and then they come alive, even though they were already alive, and start attacking people. As you can imagine, most people don't like this. And how people react to or seek to solve those problems is what gives rise to all the different factions. For one, you have the Railroad. They believe that synths are people, and they don't think they should be governed by the Institute, and they don't think that they should be persecuted by the commoners that are afraid of them, because, well, from their perspective, they're essentially have killed their loved ones and replaced them. The Railroad seeks to give the synths a new life by basically reprogramming them, which I didn't really think about being as dark as it is until DiMA, a character from Far Harbor, points out his issues with that. Which is interesting considering some of the spoilers regarding him. The second faction is the Brotherhood of Steel. They see the synths as a sign of how humanity has gone too far with technology. They don't like all the futuristic technology, even though they use a lot of it. They seek to destroy, or at the very least regulate, everything, including the synths. The third faction is the Institute, and they see the synths basically just as tools. Since they created them, they don't really appreciate them as people, they just want to use them to their end. I guess I should also mention the Minutemen, and now that I have, I can move on. Now, in essence, Far Harbor is just kind of a smaller scaled version of the main storyline. You go to a new place seeking a child who's gone missing, and you meet three different factions that all have different reactions to the various world-building elements at play. You'd think that would suck. Hey, what gives? This DLC I just bought and paid for is just a shorter, lesser version of the game I already played. The thing is, though, I don't think it's lesser. It is definitely much shorter, but there are some interesting points to be made about the storytelling and how that compares to the base game. So, Far Harbor. Here our story begins with a family whose daughter, Kasumi, comes under the belief that she is a synth. She hears a radio broadcast from across the sea saying that there's a synth refuge on the island of Far Harbor, and she decides to strike out on her own to try and find it. Her father tracks you and Nick Valentine down and asks for help. Nick isn't a necessary companion for this quest, but I do recommend bringing him along because he is important. And so in Far Harbor, you again meet three main factions. The people of Far Harbor, who are simple fishermen just trying to get by and live life. They are afraid of this radioactive fog that has kind of plagued the island, and they don't really react well to strangers. There is Acadia, the synth refuge that Kasumi fled to, which is led by DiMA, who's essentially Nick's brother. And as a side point for that, I like that they set up Nick's memory loss in advance. When Kasumi's father first finds you, Nick has trouble remembering him and makes a comment about his processors getting old or something like that. Planting that seed that Nick is old enough that he's starting to lose some of his earlier memories fades right into meeting DiMA when Nick has to struggle to remember his time from the Institute and how they were essentially made together. Finally, we have the Children of Atom, which are a cult that worship the power of the atom, or radiation. They're born out of an irradiated wasteland, and when some people are affected by it more than others, it kind of gives rise to the belief that some people are blessed by Atom and more equipped to survive it. The individual people here are surprisingly just normal, but the leadership is very extreme and kind of messed up. So first I want to discuss just some general ideas about the factions. In Skyrim, the factions are isolated. A pro to this is that you get to progress the storylines to the fullest. There's nothing that will come in and stop you from completing all of the missions for one group, because then you can just move on and go complete all of the missions for the next group. The con is that they do feel isolated. Like the world building doesn't necessarily interplay with itself. In Fallout, the factions don't just interact, but they oppose each other. They have very different ways of doing things, and there comes a point in the game where you have to choose one specifically that you want to support. And whichever one you choose, that is the faction that you will progress through. All the other factions disown you. And again, there are pros and cons to this. The pro is that it feels, I guess, like there are more stakes and your decisions have weight. The con is that you can't complete all of the quests. Also, and this doesn't really pertain to that idea specifically, but just while we're comparing Fallout to Skyrim, in Skyrim, I guess it feels more like you're your own sort of person, that you're discovering the faction and you're progressing with them. You're going on quests, of course, because that's how these RPG games work. You meet people, they give you quests. But in Fallout, it specifically feels like I'm just going along with a cause. Like, the quest givers aren't necessarily characterized well, and they don't necessarily have to be, like, really well-written characters. But in Skyrim, they usually participate in the quests and have more personal reasons for wanting you to do what they want you to do. And quite often it ends with the leader of the faction getting killed and you taking their place, so, you know, feels a little more fulfilling than just kind of being a cog in the system. Now in Far Harbor, I noticed that a lot of quests ended up being optional. Now that may not seem like a good thing necessarily, but I kind of ended up appreciating it. I did all of the optional quests, and I do think that that's probably the best way to play the game, even though it kind of defeats the purpose of them being optional. Because each one, if I'm remembering right, provides extra details for kind of the story and the setting that I found valuable. I don't know if this makes sense, but it kind of gives your player character more agency. Like I said, with the base game, you're basically just following orders the whole time. And while you can choose what to do and what not to do, in the end you're kind of just following their cause. And of course, all of this will vary depending on how you play the game, but I felt a lot more like my own man being able to investigate each side before I chose one. But that's mostly because I put off completing the main quest lines until I had completed all of the optional side quests, because I wanted to know as much as I could about all of the factions. But yeah, in Far Harbor, there's no real cause that you must support. There's no save the world storyline that you have to complete. It feels a lot more like you get to make the decisions of how to move forward, and it felt like there was a lot more interaction with the NPCs giving you the quests. Instead of just receiving orders, you're doing favors. You're helping people. Aside from the leaders, the main storyline does give you a lot of companions that you can walk around with. And I found that when those companions have quests, it's a lot more interesting. Characters like Nick Valentine or Kate are a lot more memorable because they actually ask you to do things with them. You go on very personal adventures for them, and that feels like the story and the gameplay are holding hands, if you will. The other companions are fine, like Piper's really likable, but if you're just standing there listening to them talk each time they progress in the affinity, it's not as investing. And that's one thing that really confused me. Like, the entire time I'm playing Fallout, I keep thinking, why doesn't each companion have their own personal quest? That would bump up the game by several notches, in my opinion. And it's right there. Like, you would do that with a few of them. Why not do that with the rest of them? It would make it a lot more rewarding to have them as companions if you went on personal missions for them, with them. Throughout the base game, I never really care that much about the quest givers. Desdemona, Elder Maxim, even Father, who's your son, what the game is all about. Beyond the initial shock of finding out that your son is actually an old man, which I kind of saw coming, there's not a whole lot to his character. He believes he's doing the right thing. He's trying to control the world in order to fix it. But that's fairly standard sci-fi villain stuff. There should be tension and dilemma. This is your son, who you've been fighting to save this entire time. And now you find out that he's actually the leader of the organization you thought were the bad guys. And to top it all off, he's dying, and you have to choose whether to make him a villain or an ally. The tough decision is there on the surface. So, like pretty much every decision in the game, I didn't really make it based off of emotions or storytelling. I just went with what I thought would be the, funner option. I based it off the gameplay. I chose the railroad because I thought it would be fun to go undercover into the Institute, and once I was there, I was already embedded in the railroad, so I thought I'd see that through. When I had to break up with Father and leave him for dead, I personally didn't really feel anything. And I should have. Now let's compare this to DiMA. He is a peacekeeper at heart. He wants to live life without conflict, but he is still a cold, calculating machine. As you uncover the memories that he's locked away and left behind him, you start to learn that he has made some pragmatic and even murderous decisions, all for the sake of peace. He'll do whatever it takes to protect the most lives, even if that means sacrificing a few. It is interesting to compare DiMA to Nick. They've both killed people to protect others. Nick is a detective. He investigates crimes that leads him to culprits, and they're often dangerous mobsters. When he kills, it's after the fact. It's justice. DiMA predicts problems and takes steps to solve them in advance. It may seem a little counterintuitive, but this actually makes me think it may be morally better to let bad things happen and bring justice than to try and stop it in the first place. Nick kills killers. He's not a murderer. DiMA is considered a murderer because the people he's killed haven't actually done anything yet. This creates a kind of great example of a morally gray character. I can't honestly say that he's a bad guy, but he has done very bad things. I do think that morally gray stories are a little overrated, mostly because it seems like everyone wants to be the next Game of Thrones. But if you can do them well, it does create some great conflict. Give your characters some hard decisions to make. Give your players, your readers, your audience something to think about afterwards. Is this move the right thing to do? It's complicated. So as I investigated each group in Far Harbor, it became less about their ideologies and more about the people. In short, I became attached. And that brought the conflict. So Kasumi needs to know if she can trust the people of Acadia, namely DiMA, their leader. Jody, one of the synths you meet there, is suffering from nightmares and I guess just PTSD, or it kind of seems like bipolarism. And you find out that this is because she's had her mind reprogrammed without her consent. Avery, the leader of Far Harbor, without going into too many spoilers, is probably the one who has the most to say against DiMA, and she doesn't even know it at the time that you find her. So from the perspective of each of these characters, DiMA needs to be brought to justice. The thing is, I understand why he did what he did. I end up liking DiMA, wanting to give him the benefit of the doubt, and feeling the need to protect him, or at least what he's built. That's why I did every single optional quest, because I wanted to know the whole story. Because here's the problem. If I tell anyone what I know about DiMA, it will mean war, and everything that he's worked to build will collapse. The system is not great, admittedly. There's a lot of problems. DiMA's kind of played both sides on some occasions, and the people, nobody's perfect, essentially. But if it falls, people will die. So who do I want to save? I relate to the people of Far Harbor, and want those people to live their lives unmolested. But they are hot-headed, stubborn, and a tad racist. They deserve the truth, but I know they will overreact. The easiest people to judge as the villains would be the Children of Adam. They're a creepy cult. They've killed people. They did cause, or at least aggravate, the radioactive fog that everybody is scared of. But that's mostly the leadership's fault. They used to have a more reasonable monarch who made peace with both DiMA and Far Harbor. But then he was overthrown by the current extremists. As you're looking into the Children of Adam, there are definitely a lot of bad things going on, but not the normal people who have just been indoctrinated. Like, you meet Zealot Ware. The optional quest you go on him is literally just he wants to help his friend. That makes him kind of likable. The real Children of Adam just want to survive and live in peace. Just like the refugee synths of Acadia. And just like the struggling fishermen of Far Harbor. Even though I like that in the main game, each group have their own different goals and missions that conflict, I kind of love that in Far Harbor, they all just want the same thing, to survive. But since they can't get over their smaller differences, you know they can't really survive together. Far Harbor wants everything to go back to the way it was. The Children of Adam want radiation to take over the whole island. Acadia wants acceptance, even if they have to fight for control to get it. You aren't deciding who to support or which storyline you want to pursue. You're choosing who you can live with killing. These kinds of hard, gray decisions leave an impact. My first game, I played through the Railroad storyline. But right before I started the Season Pass, I did start a second game and play through the Brotherhood of Steel. And so I can say that there is a pretty hard decision you have to make regarding Paladin Danse. At the end of his storyline, if you get that far, you learn some things about Dance's background, that causes conflict. His whole world is shattered, and you have to decide how to guide his path forward. This was tough and haunting, and there was no way around it. The thing is, though, it happens at the very end of the Brotherhood story arc. You already have to commit yourself to it in order to get to the good stuff. So when I played as the Railroad, and I had to fight and kill Paladin Danse earlier on in the story, I didn't feel anything because I hadn't learned that much about his character. Even though I had done some of the quests with him and learned some of what he knew of his backstory, I never interacted with him that much, so I didn't get attached. All of these elements in Far Harbor create a sense of impending tragedy that wasn't really there in the base game, and that caused me to think about it for a while after playing. Granted, I did think about the main storyline after playing, but that was more because of like the potential I saw in the world building. Because after Amazon announced that they were planning on making a show led by Jonathan Nolan, brother of Chris, that guy. Because after that announcement was made, I may have given my brother just a couple of rundowns of the different facets of the world and why I was excited to see where they go with it. So before I give my final statements, I want to just say a little more about Kasumi. She's not the most active or developed character, but she is kind of interesting. As far as I can tell, she's not actually a synth. Because really the only way to tell the difference between a synth and a human is if they die and you dissect their brain to see if they have any computer components that are regulating their bodies. There are plenty of examples of characters that you thought were regular humans but then turned out to be synths, but I think this is the only time where you think she could be a synth and then she turns out to be human. Except for that lady that killed her son or something. That was a random encounter that I had a while back. I can't remember the details of what exactly happened. I also just think it's funny, but also a little sad, that this is how teenagers work. This is the teenager of your post-apocalyptic world. It's not a phase, Mom. I really am a synth. I felt like they could have done more with that concept. And that's one reason why I think, a show could be interesting, because you could have more, character development, and you could go into more of the psychology of, what do you do in that situation if you don't know for sure that someone is a synth? But for the most part, Kasumi's just a character you report your findings to. In the end, there is a peaceful option. But you have to pass several pretty hard speech checks, as well as, I believe, helping everyone in Far Harbor. Because like I said, this will all play out differently if you make different decisions. But there comes a time when you have to convince the people of Far Harbor to either follow you, or if you don't convince them, then they'll go with the more violent option. And since I had done every single side quest, when it came for the people to make their decision, one by one, everyone said, I'm going to follow the outsider. I forget what they call you. The mainlander. I want to follow the mainlander. And they say that they're doing it specifically because you helped them. So that felt rewarding. I don't know how it would have turned out if I hadn't done all of those side quests. If you don't help them, will they side with Alan and then go on a rampage for Acadia? I don't know. I'm just glad that I helped them. After it was all said and done, I was able to see Kasumi back to her parents. And that was kind of bittersweet. I know that a game has been good if it ends and then I have that feeling of oh, it's over. So what do I do with my life now? And I did get that here. A little bit. But it was there. So those were my thoughts on Fallout Far Harbor. Technically, it was my thoughts on a lot of different things, but Far Harbor was the subject. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Have you played the game? What did you think? There's a section for that. But until next time, see you later. If you're gonna be a pal, if you're gonna be a buddy, you can stay in here. But if you're gonna be a rambunctious kitten and chew on things, then I'm gonna have to kick you out again. Zippy looks concerned. Don't concern your half-sister.